I want to welcome everybody to History Room Live. Welcome back to History Room Live. History Room Live is a program of the Saginaw History and Genealogy Room at Patent Free Library in Bath, Maine. I'm Jill Pickett-Roy. I'm the archivist and special collections librarian here, and I'm so pleased to be back on Zoom with all of you as we begin this second season of virtual programming today, April 9th. Today's program happens to take place during a very fitting time period. It is both National Poetry Month and National Library Week. Here at the library, we've been talking about how the adjustments of the past year have caused us to embrace virtual programming, which in turn has enabled us to make new connections and foster connections among our patrons in a new way. We're reaching people outside of our service area, like today's speaker, and getting to know each other and providing library services within and outside of Saginaw County. For me personally, it has been such a positive experience to get to know so many of you through History Room Live. And I just want to say that if our programming has supported you throughout the last year, I recommend that you learn about ways that you can support the library through the link that I'll put in the chat. Maybe your support comes from a donation, or maybe you become a volunteer, like Linda, who's here, or Malcolm, who's volunteering today. Or maybe you make a donation of materials to the History Room in support of our local history collection. I'll just say, for example, we do not have a copy of the 1956 Morris High School yearbook.
Oh.
I'll take a moment and put that link in the chat now.
No.
There's a couple of other things I'd like to tell you before we start the program. Our library has been closed to the public since Thanksgiving, but we are reopening on Monday, April 12th during the morning hours from 10 to 1. And we also have a second program that we're putting on this evening at 7 p.m. Hemingway scholar Susan Beagle will be doing a question and answer session about her experience working with Ken Burns on the new Hemingway documentary series. So I just wanted to let you know that if you are not tired of programming by the time we wrap up today, there is more, and you can find out about that as well with the link in the chat. Our presenter today is one of History Room Live's biggest supporters. Malcolm Hamilton grew up in Bath and is a 1956 graduate of Morris High School. I do have a photocopy of his yearbook here. It says, Malcolm has proven to be one of the smartest boys in the class. With his attitude towards work, we all know he will succeed in teaching history. After graduating from University of Maine, Malcolm actually taught English in Massachusetts before earning his master's in library science from Simmons College, which led him to a 30-year career at Harvard Library. I'm so pleased to welcome Malcolm as a speaker after getting to know him last year through this program. Today, Malcolm will teach us some of the vast history that is referenced in his friend Roger D. Skillings' poem, King's Dock. As his yearbook says, we all know that he will succeed. I'm going to be giving Malcolm a break from speaking periodically by reading some of the poem, but until then, Malcolm's going to give me a break, and I'm going to turn it over to him and start the slide presentation. So Malcolm, you go ahead.
Ready?
Thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's good to be here. It's been a delight working with Jill. I'll be so glad when this program is over, but so unhappy that I don't have a reason to hop into the patent library remotely. Anyway, something has just happened. There we are. All right, today we're using Roger's poem, the King's Dock, as a method, as a vehicle to talk about the early history of Bath, Maine, something with which many of us have a great deal of affection. Roger was born in Bath in October 1937 and died in January 2020. This is a picture of Roger with his daughter Marissa, and I think Heidi told me that it was Christmas 2017. He was a significant writer of short stories, novels, and poetry. He and I, and several others who are here today, I'm pleased to say, were born in Bath, Maine. We grew up together in this town that can have such a powerful impact on a carefree, impressionable child and teenager. As a child, Roger lived in the house at King's Dock, which is a significant focus of the talk today. Shortly after college at Bowdoin, where he and Paul Johnson both went, Roger moved to Provincetown, where he married and spent his life writing short stories, some collected into book form, poetry, and a couple of novels. Roger's wife, Heidi John Schmidt, also a writer of some note, still lives in P-Town. Their daughter, Marissa, is a student at Harvard Law School. So we keep getting these Harvard connections. Heidi is with us today. The poem is 312 miles, 312 lines long. And because it is long, we will omit certain parts in the reading today. Full copies have been provided for you to read, and the lines of the poem have been numbered for reference purposes. Jill will read portions of the poem, and I will add commentary. And as I said, using the poem as a vehicle, we'll cover a broad span of the history of Bath, Maine, the city, the town, the city that so influenced his early development, his philosophy, his thinking, his writing. But this is not a program about Roger, so his biography will wait for another time. We'll go back in time as he did when the land along the Kennebec belonged to the Abenakis, the Dawn people, how Roger lamented their treatment, to the time of their conflicts with the white settlers, to a time when there was but one street in Bath, the town road, later named High Street, when all of the land between the town road and the river was forest, where the only houses in the town were on the town road, including Joseph Lambert's Tavern, the Hagen House, opposite the head of Park Street, and a few paths that led down to the shore. We'll go back to a time when transportation was primarily by water along the Kennebec River. As late as the 1770s, the river from Merrymeeting Bay to Popham was called the Sagadahoc River. Dummer Sewell's 1794 map is one of the first to call it the Kennebec. We'll go back to a time when a road later named Harwood Street connected the town road to the river, where King George III's agents and carpenters set up a dock to ship trees to England for masts and spars and lumber for shipbuilding, to fill the king's growing need to build warships when England's old growth forest had been denuded. We go back to a time when trees in the forests were marked with a broad arrow by those agents, claiming them as the sole property of the king, further sowing the seeds of the American Revolution. It wasn't just a tax on tea. We'll go back to a time when patriots like Dummer Sewell demanded in the name of the people of America that these king's carpenters not strike another blow and immediately leave the king's dock. Jill?
Before I begin, I just want to mention, one, I love this poem. Two, there are some phrases and words that we don't use so much today. A couple things that I'm a little uncomfortable reading, but I will read them anyway because they're not my words, they're the words of the poet. And with that, I'll begin at the beginning. There, where the Kennebec River runs both ways, where the wide tidal water moves with massive pull, shore once of King George III, muddy boulders, piling stubs, a many-windowed sunlit house, shipwright built on a steep rise, high lawn by mid-July, meshy with wormy pears, lower field flattened with salt hay at full moon. A long neglected blackened Revolutionary War plaque on a lichen-scaled glacial rock. The ragged stump of a baby blue spruce hacked down one Christmas, unmissed until spring. A cask of white lilac, luxuriant and tended, enclosing a dank, antiquated stone well. Glints of mica, feldspar, quartz, and flint comprise my memories of childhood innocence. I was 8 on VJ Day. The kitchen radio static roared and they danced around me, their only progeny. Knee-banged rock climber, beguiled by the only real danger, lured by my parents' dire warnings and fear of the medium mysterious. Flew from the house, colorless, transparent up close, that could snatch a stick boat away quicker than I could reach. Gold-spangled, hypnotic, suck and swirl or gray, wind-riled flaps and spray. Still as a dark mirror at full flood tide, reeking mud flaps at dead low ebb, with a ledge far out where seagulls stood.
In April 1775, Captain Simeon Turner, master of the sloop Racehorse, in the wood and lumber trade, sailed from Salem, Mass. To the Kennebec River. Once there, however, his crew abandoned the ship upon hearing that they might be commandeered by the British. By 1783, they were commandeered by the British, by the way. By 1783, Captain Turner had returned to the Kennebec and bought a farm from the Heath heirs and built the house at the foot of what would later be called Harwood Street, the house that we have come to call the House at King's Dock. That is 1463 Washington Street, where Roger lived. This map, which is included in one of the standard histories of Bath, shows the map of the city as it was in those days. You can see the single double line all the way from top to bottom, bottom to top. That's the town road. At the top of it is a small inlet with a sort of bubble-like affair. That's where the King's Dock was. And on the promontory just above it is where the house at King's Dock is. And that was built by Simeon Turner. The properties that were owned in those days went all the way from the Kennebec to the New Meadows River. In 1783, also banner year for Bath, John Peterson from Duxbury, Massachusetts, said to have had Mayflower connections, settled on the Brunswick shore of the New Meadows River and began a shipbuilding business. 15 years later, in 1797 or 1798, the sources vary, Captain Simeon Turner sold his house and land to John Peterson, 148 acres that included the house, the dock, and extended from the Kennebec to the New Meadows River, and included the hill that the Sewells would later use to build the Stonehouse Farm. Peterson himself built a fine house called by some a mansion, 2 stories with a cupola, on the south side of Harwood Street at the top of the hill. Later in 1895, that would become the old couple's home, but it was torn down in the 1930s. Peterson's son Levi occupied the house built by Turner on the point. Levi Lamont, who wrote A History of Bath, says that Levi Turner weighed 400 pounds, and while that's probably an exaggeration, which Lamont
Jaw.
which was he was frequently accused of. Levi Peterson was a big man and occupied the house that Turner built on the point. Father and son Petersons also built a mill at Wisgate. In 1798, John Peterson, extensively engaged in shipbuilding, dug a canal from New Meadows River to Merrymeeting Bay to float logs to his shipyard on the New Meadows. Over time, this proved unsuccessful, partly because
Helps up here now.
the bay was too low. So,
Before I read, I want to show you this present day view of that part of Bath. I'll switch back one more time. And here are the two side by side. This is the house at King's Dock. And this is the site just south of the dock, or just south of the house today.
that's where the dock was.
So beginning at line 93. When I was 10, Father had gates set up at the driveway's end. 4 rough granite blocks, like 2 pair of giant steps, piled 2 by 2 astride the grassy track, 5 feet high, raw as new tombstones. How grand they must have seemed to his ambitious eye. How promising, his squat block columns, bargained from a quarryman friend, raised among strewn stones, rose-buried bones of an old wall. But on the sultry air, no matter what the hour, a riveter's pound, like a sleepless whine, rang echoes from the ironworks, a mile downriver, where warships were always a-building. The other way was Merrymeeting Bay, dauntless flights of honking geese, and the old secret life of inland Maine. To afford a more prestigious house, live nearer the center of town, Father sacrificed King's Dock and summers on the river when I was 12, the goals yet to inaugurate the gate as bivalve anvils. And lucky others since have lived in the light-filled house on that idyllic hill on the long reach, now Bath, once a part of Sagadahoc, where the English displaced the Don people, the proud Kennebec Abenakis.
In 1806, Washington Street could finally be extended all the way to Day's Ferry because the bridge at Peterson's Dock had been built. In that same year in Bath, Center Street and South Street were laid out to connect. Am I in the right place? Yes, sorry, mumble, mumble. In that same year in Bath, Center Street and South Street were laid out to connect Washington Street with the town road, which is now High Street. Before this, to get to the King's Dock by land, one had to take High Street to Harwood Street. By 1817, Thomas Harwood Sr., here's a picture of the more prestigious house, and it really was. By 1817, Thomas Harwood Sr. built in his Bodenham shipyard the 113-ton schooner Two Brothers, with her master as T. Harwood Jr., later a prominent Bath shipbuilder known as Major Thomas Harwood. By at least 1828, Major Harwood was building vessels at the old Peterson dock, the King's Dock. Harwood lived in the mansion that Peterson had built on what was finally named Harwood Street. 100 years later, in 1929, Emily Pease of Thomaston married Roger D. Skillings Sr. of Bath. Roger Jr., their only child, was not born until 1937. They lived in the house at King's Dock where young Roger grew up. And in 1949, the Skillings had moved to the more prestigious house, and Roger was 11. And now we'll move to 226.
Starting at lines 145, is that right?
Right.
Okay. Whence, pushing ever north and east, the relentless Protestants in 1724 massacred the Norridgewock, scalped the Sagamore Abomazine and their soul-loving counselor, lexicographer and bulwark of New France, the fierce black robe Sebastian Rail. Then took Louisbourg and Quebec, while the river sang with sawmill and hammer, the primeval forest's doom, till Owenox alone, who, wherefrom, owned all the Dawnland, home of the great being, great warrior, great lover of life, who wore the stars, sun and moon, whose forbidden face was seen in the white gales of Mount Patati, whose rocky feet and legs roared down to crush the heathland. Where, in 1775, the cocky posterity of the victors, in a bloody century of 5 intimate, hardly demarcated border wars against the heretical abomination of French Catholicism and its allies, the native spawn of Satan, whose forebears loud dogs and lean cows learned to scout tomahawk and arrow, share their master's terror of the dancing floors of the torture island. Ritual sites of fires that burned all night, down to their own time shunned by every living thing, but the mournful herons and cocks. These inheritors considered themselves an up-and-coming lot, makers of a new empire, sweet Beulah land, plenty of boots and staves, shingles and fish, and at a word of Lexington, 8 days on the way, without a shot, ordered off King George's 40 carpenters, hewing masts and spars at His Majesty's dock, arrested the royal agent, Mr. Perry, Esquire, speedily raised a volunteer company that marched to Cambridge in 6 days, fought at Bunker Hill behind the rail fence, came Nabob's home unscathed, not a known Tory to be found in the town. Redoubtably peopled the whole reach, from Whiskeg Creek all the way to Winnegate, Phippsburg and Popham Beach, fished, built clipper ships, plied the seas, grew rich, declined with wood and wind, throve again with steam and steel.
That's a really good line. I like that.
This is a picture of the massacre at Norridgewock in 1724. The man under the cross is Sebastian Rail. Let me add a couple of footnotes to what you just heard. The Jesuit missionary and lexicographer Sebastian Rail was believed to have stoked the hostility against the settlers by the Indians with whom he lived at Norridgewock. Father Rail always supported those elements in the tribe which maintained an active resistance to the English. The increasing English settlement in the Kennebec area, he thought, as Roger thought later, was a threat to the Abenakis. A portion of the poem you just heard mentions sweet Beulah land. Well, this is Roger digging back into his classical education. Beulah land comes from John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, in which Beulah land is a place of peace near the end of the Christian life, on the border of the celestial city. And Colonel Dummer Sewell, D-U-M-M-E-R, in case there is any question, came to Bath from York, Maine in 1762, a natural leader, educated, who dominated local affairs for many years. Upon learning of the events at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, he led a contingent of 50 armed Bath citizens by land to King's Dock and proclaimed, "In the name of the people of America, I command you not to strike another blow." And it is documented in all of the histories that they ceased and departed by boat to their 2 ships anchored nearby, and forthwith left the river. The king's agent, Edward Parry, with whom Sewell was friendly, was detained at Lambert's Tavern until he promised that no further masts or lumber would be shipped. Sewell died in Bath at age 94. And this, what you're seeing, the map is a map from 1795 that Dummer Sewell was required by some agency to ship to Massachusetts to document the city of the town of Bath. There is a building underneath the word Bath, which in this image is probably too small to see. And Jill and I have wondered what it was. That little body of water that it sits beside is the mill pond at the end of Whiskey Creek. And we wonder if maybe Dummer Sewell knew that that's where the high school was going to go eventually. Anyway, it's a fun map. And it even shows above the word Bath that there was in 1795 a bridge across Whiskey. Jill, you're on.
Okay. Starting at line 228. I ride the annual August cruise, restless, drink in hand. The day fades, inscrutable stars appear, and the Sassanoa, emanating murmured lauds, laughter, spoken beer, wheels in the vast silent bay and slips on the tide, back down the river, berths beneath the monster bridge, beyond which the salmon-colored Argon lights flare all night on the grotesque shapes of guided missile frigates. Through these gates pass the best shipbuilders in the world. We are the nuclear people, begetters of future woe. The Stone Age race left little trace in 30,000 years.
And here I'll interrupt again. I do not like to contradict Roger, but he's wrong. 30,000 years ago, Maine was under an ice sheet a mile thick. The first humans appeared about 11,000 years ago. By the time of our history, the Wabanaki Confederation was well established, and the Abenakis left more than a trace. For one thing, their ancestors are still living among us today, and they left a trace. They left a trace more durable than granite monuments. Listen, you can hear their voices. Abagadasset, Abenaki, Algonquin, Algonquian, Androscoggin, Arausic, Chewonki, Kabasakanti, Damerscotta, Katahdin, Kennebec, Malaga, Maliseet, Maramitan, Merry Meeting, Micmac, Monswig, Naquasset, Nawagan, Norridgewock, Passamaquoddy, Pemaquid, Penobscot, Piscataqua, Sagadahoc, Sagamore, Sassanoa, Sabasco, Sebago, Sheepscut, Wabanaki, Wisgig, Winnegans, Wiscasset, Their words are all around us if you're familiar with Bath.
Line 299. At Kingstock, Father's 4 granite blocks have sunken half from sight, 2 beneath and 2 above the ground. Rife weeds and vines enwreathe them. The house on the hill is dark. The glimmering river is still. Listen. But the steeple deity doesn't speak. That gurgle is a drain. The brain has eaten everything, even art, and spat it out. The superfluous soul dispersed. The grave of hopes is full.
And there's the house. 1783, it's still there today. As a young man, just after the family had moved out, Roger and I went there by bicycle, and he had a key. We went in, and I was just amazed that the windows, many of them, had the roundels. It had been blown glass rather than the kind of glass we were familiar with. And it is a fine house with good bones. Thank you, Jill. That was such great fun.
Thank you, Malcolm. It was a pleasure.